I think it's probably better in other circumstances that Surinder keep coming and keep enlivening all of you with his thoughts and his work. And as Vivek just mentioned, he's not going to stop writing. He's retiring from officially, but he's a very academically very engaged person and is going to go on and on. The reason I called this presentation, which is going to be a very brief one, from the periphery to the center, is because of two things. One is caste, of course, we talked about it. The other is rural-urban relationships. And both these, you will find that the issues that Surinder raises are issues that people usually do not pay too much attention to. And if they do so today, to a large extent, it is because people like him have foregrounded these features. For example, the study of villages, and Surinder has done a lot of work on that. Study of villages, not the old-fashioned study of villages. It's not as if you're studying a village, as it used to be in the early days, but this is a village in the nexus of the city of India, of a number of other things also happening around the village and in the village and impacting the village. So the village doesn't stand on its own, it's a node within a nexus. And it's this aspect of the village which I think is very, very important. And for a long, long time, when we did village studies, we didn't take that into account. And I think Surinder is quite right in remembering Professor Andre Bete, who was probably one of the first to highlight this issue and bring it to central focus. Yes, Bailey did it too, but I think Bete's work and following that, people like Surinder Jodhka, they made this village into something more than just an isolate, but a phenomenon that exists with cross-cutting relationships. The village, yes, is not just a thing. It's not just out there with its open drains and poverty and so forth. A village is also made up of relations between people. So in that sense, the old-fashioned village, which I think Vivek just mentioned, the Surinder talked about in the book that I edited, that old-fashioned village is really not there anymore. It's changing quite rapidly, and I'll spend a little time on that in the following few minutes. The second issue is that of caste. And here again, Surinder brings in things which are not central in most of our writings till very recently. I think Surinder is one of the first who did, in fact, think about how caste can be seen in ways other than just pure hierarchy, but in terms of identities that are dominant, and these identities play an important role, especially when we try to understand caste mobility, caste politics, and very importantly, again, an issue which has been rarely talked about, but he brings it up, and that is about entrepreneurship amongst the scheduled castes. I think this is something which is really quite remarkable, this feature, and I am quite surprised that this aspect of Surinder's work hasn't had too many follow-ups as it should have, or maybe I'm missing out. But I think this particular vein that is opened is quite remarkable and should be pursued, and I hope some of you will. What kind of entrepreneurship the scheduled castes people are entering into. Now, if you look at the village, which I said is not a thing, but relationship between people, and I'm here reflecting a lot of things that Surinder has written about, and I have also contributed sort of in these areas, and that is that the old zamindari system has gone. And with the vanishing of the zamindari system, relations between people have changed, and not only changed gradually, but changed quite dramatically. The rich have certainly gotten poorer, but the poor have remained poor and haven't got richer. So when you have the zamindari abolition, people thought that maybe the poor will suddenly come into riches and become wealthy. That hasn't happened. But the rich certainly have lost their dominance, and this has had a very important effect on caste relations, because in the early days, the caste system worked in a fashion where the top position was occupied by the landlord, who was also the most powerful, and as you came down the hierarchy, the poorer people filled in the blanks. But now that's no longer the case, because the village landlord, the dominant caste, was no longer the patron anymore. Consequently, over time, land reforms happened automatically. It didn't happen so much because of political pressure, but once zamindari was taken away, then gradually the structure itself asserted itself, and over time about 80-81% of land, as you know, is below 2 hectares today. With that kind of holding, there is no real need for land reforms any longer, because that has already taken place. Now, if this is the case, then what has happened also, additionally, is that once upon a time, well, not too far back, over 60% of India's economy was roughly rural. Today, it is not more than 14%, and I'm being quite generous here. Around 14 to 15% is probably rural, but that is not the full story. I think to get the full story of village India, the transformation of village India, one should look at the fact that almost 37 to 38% of our country's population is made up of migrants. 37%, I think, is what the census says it is, and the latest statistical data suggests is around 29%. Even if it's so, between 29 and 37%, that is more than 1 in every 3 person in India is a migrant. That's a lot of migrants, really. And this is also, it's also important to note that it is not always rural to urban migration that we should pay attention to, because though the rural to urban migration is very dramatic, you leave the village, you come to the city, and trains are full of migrants, and so many movies have been made on that. But there's also a significant amount of rural to rural migration, and this is not simply women getting married, but about 18% of migrants are actually going out looking for jobs. In other words, the village is no longer a rural area anymore, which is why about 67% of rural non-farm employment is non-agricultural, which is a lot. So when you go to a village, you would say that, well, this is a village, looks like a village, it smells like a village, but it's not really a village in many ways. It does fulfill certain characteristics in terms of population density, number of people, and so forth, but in terms of the economy itself, it's not a village any longer. It's very, very different. And when people migrate out of the village, especially men, when they migrate out of the village, they're not going somewhere else for rest and relaxation. They're going there to work, which is why about 51% of MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises, almost 51%, if not a little more, of MSMEs are located in villages, not in cities. So village India has a whole lot of MSMEs functioning. Now those MSMEs are very small and understaffed and also low technology. Whatever be the case, they are also employing a lot of people, and many of them are self-employed, who don't have a job in a regular job and who do not want to pursue agriculture either. Now many of them are also, as you know, migrating. As a result, the point about women which Vivek raised and which Surinder also talks about is interesting, because today about 30% or more of rural households are headed by women. Women-headed households, which is something you wouldn't have imagined earlier. And what really took me aback was when I read that about 50% of land in village India is cultivated by women. Now listen, I wouldn't have believed either of these figures had I not seen them myself. I did see a large number of women actually running households in village India and also working in the fields. This is an aspect which is not picked up adequately enough even by the Mandal Commission. But a large number of women, a very large number of women, are today manning the fields. Why? Because the men have left. They've gone to work wherever, from Jaunpur to Jaipur, or from Tirupur to Trivandrum, whatever be the case. They've traveled long distances. When I went to Tirupur, I was quite surprised how many people came from Kishanganj to Tirupur. And all of this happened in 10 or 15 years. Before that, most of the migrants in Tirupur, you know about Tirupur, is the hosiery capital of India, perhaps of the world. And a large number of migrants go there. But in the late 1990s, there were very few migrants from North India, Northeast India. I'm going to think of Kishanganj as Northeast. And in another 4 or 5 years, I found so many of them. So the movement from village to city has grown over time, but what has also happened is movement from village to village. The workshops that are there in village India are not the fancy large-scale workshops, though there are some. There's this gentleman called Mr. Gadawat in Maharashtra who runs a very large detergent company, and that detergent company produces more detergents than the Unilever, Hindustan Lever. And he is very, very rich. He has, in the morning, he has a problem whether he should go by helicopter or by car. He has, a major dilemma there. So there are such large industries as well. Many factories have opened branches in rural India. Why? Because real estate prices are low. But by and large, most of the enterprises in rural India are very small enterprises, low skilled, and often what they call own account enterprise, which I would call distress entrepreneurship. And so many of them are that kind. What are they doing? They are weaving carpets or weaving cloth, or they're moving or fashioning wooden objects, clay objects, zari work, a whole range of things. And they're employed in those enterprises. And what is startling is that what they're producing in the small village huts or in this village loom, which are dark and dank, what they're producing there is actually being sold in shops in New York and Europe and France and Sweden and elsewhere. So the linkage from village to the world is very much there, but the villager herself or himself is still in the village, giving the impression that the village is a village in the old-fashioned way. It certainly is not. What is even more startling is that most young people in the village are encouraged by their parents, mothers included, to leave the village and find a job elsewhere. And so many of them have not even learned the traditional craft of their parents. When I met the villagers in Jaunpur and Mirzapur, I spent some time studying carpet weaving and agriculture. I asked some of these weavers who were, 40 years old or older, whether when they had learned to weave carpets. And they said when we were 12, 13, 14, and how long did it take you? 6 weeks to 8 weeks, because carpets over there are not very intricate carpets. They're very straightforward carpets. It didn't take very long. And who taught you? My father taught me, or my uncle taught me. Now came the killer question: have you taught your children to weave? And you must believe me, 100% said no. We have not taught our children to weave because we don't want them to be where we are, working in this dark looms and getting, and in those days, 9,000 rupees a month. It's just not worth it. We hope that they will get a job somewhere else. Now you would have thought that these village kids are probably, studying hard and, doing the reading, writing, arithmetic in earnest. They're not really. They're just whistling and hands in the pockets, kicking a can down the street, hoping for somebody down up there in some slum somewhere who will send them a signal and off they go. So that is the way in which the village India is actually looking at itself, the young in India, which is why about 70% of those who are 60 plus in our country live in villages. Villages are places for old people. Young people are moving out. And that is very, very visible if you go to any village today. You'll find most of the young people are gone, many men are gone, which is why, as I said earlier, 50% of the land is cultivated by women, and over 30% of the households are run by women, are female-headed households. And you get a glimpse of this when you talk to school teachers in the villages, because they are quite exasperated by the fact that mothers turn up in school PTA meetings, and mothers are very combative, much more combative than fathers are. They want to know more about their children's work, education. They're much more involved, and that really, does upset the equilibrium of many male teachers in the villages. So women are becoming more and more involved in villages, and you also see that in another aspect which is worth thinking of, and that is the emergence of the nuclear family. According to the National Family Health Survey, about 57% of Indian families are nuclear today. And this change of almost 12% has happened in the last 15 years in the development of nuclear family. And also rural Indian women, there's been a rise in literacy much more than men. Rural Indian women literacy has gone up by roughly 12%, more than it has for men. So women are there, pushing their way, not getting it, but still not getting to the extent they like to, but they're still making an impression. And this is not happening because of women's liberation or women's movement. It's just that there are openings in the structure and the women are rushing to fill those gaps. And this is something which is, I think, quite important and will make its presence felt much more visibly in the days to come. Now, talking about caste, which is linked to this, because if the old rural structure is no longer what it used to be, then the relations that held between people is not going to be the same. Naturally, those who are once upon a time called low caste people, and I prefer to say the so-called lower caste, not the lower caste, but so-called lower caste, because nobody who's in the so-called lower caste category believes that he or she is actually low caste. So the so-called lower caste people are now finding room now to move out of the village, or if in the village, to do jobs other than agriculture. And when Surinder talks about the village of Talhan, for example, he says that in Punjab, I mean, he uses Talhan as an entry point, but in Punjab, most of these scheduled caste villagers don't work on land. A very small percentage work on land. I forget the number, I think it was 8% or so who work on land, others don't work on land. Many of them are self-employed people. And if Talhan is a kind of pointer to where things are going in rural India. Because when I also went to Talhan with him one day, on one occasion, and it was very interesting to see how the Ardharmis, who Vivek mentioned, who were earlier considered to be scheduled caste, have broken free and now have their own gurdwaras, and they give a lot of importance to Ravidas, and there's a portrait of him in the center of the Gurdwara, along with the Granth Sahib, that Ravidas is there. Now these people are, they are asserting themselves in ways which would not have been imaginable earlier. But this is a feature of Punjab, not of Punjab alone. I think this is going across the country. If we have caste politics today of the so-called lower caste and the OBCs and so forth, it is because the relationship in the village has changed. The old patron is no longer there. And the old patron is no longer there, then why should I take nonsense from that person? People are now beginning to say that, look at me, look at who I am. And that is why I think it is very important for all of us to pay attention to the Jati Puranas. That is, how do jatis, of different jatis of course, so-called upper caste and so-called lower caste jatis, see themselves? How do they visualize themselves? What is their own understanding of their origin tales? Because the Purusha Shukta legend is not something that every caste, cares about or even knows about. I was quite surprised in the 1980s when I mentioned the Purusha Shukta legend, which is from the head comes the Brahmin, shoulders the Kshatriya and so forth, to the Jats of West UP. Maybe we were talking about caste or something or the other, and they were making fun of, merchant castes, and the Jats didn't think much of the Yadavs and vice versa. So I told them that, but there's this legend where the head comes the Brahmin, and they looked at me amazed. They said, where do you get that from? I said, that's supposed to be part of Hinduism. I said, I don't know. We must be, he said, I remember clearly saying, then we must be number 2 Hindus, because we have no idea what you're talking about. How can a Brahmin be superior to me? I'm a Jat. You can't have a Brahmin who is a rice-eating, dhoti-wearing, unctuous, oily fellow who's superior to me. It's not possible. So the idea of the Purusha Shukta legend, which we read in college, as if it was the Bible for everybody, is not true at all. And this aspect is now coming to light when we think in terms of caste identity and caste politics. And when you see Punjab, or you see any part of the country, Punjab probably is heading the pack, as it always does in most cases. You will find that the old Purusha Shukta legend, go outside the university and talk to anybody who is not quite middle class and ask them over this legend of the head the Brahmin, shoulder this and that and the other, and you'll find that many of them will be quite taken aback and surprised at what you're talking about. So the story of scheduled caste people or rural entrepreneurship gives you an idea of what's happening in contemporary India. Why is it that these urban scheduled caste entrepreneurs are happy to leave the village even though they are strapped for cash, even though life is not so easy? they don't want to go back to the village because they think that they've freed themselves from the village surroundings. And this is a point that is made by Surinder in his work. And they've freed themselves and they don't want to go back and be trapped in that old nexus any longer. They want to be where they are. And interestingly enough, though they're poor, though they don't have capital, they are not doing too badly. It is not as if in the cities or in urban areas they're discriminated the same way as they were in rural India. Of course, some of them do feel discrimination, but a large majority of them do not feel it in the urban setting. And this reminds me not only of the context in which Surinder wrote, but the earlier story told to us by Mickey Marriott, which is there are two ways of looking at caste. One is the attributional way, the other is the interactional way. The attributional way is what's happening in social change in urban India. You see caste and give respect to a person in terms of the person's attributes. Is that person literate? Does that person wear a clean shirt? Does the person have a bicycle, transistor, car, motorcycle, whatever? Attributes matter a lot. In villages, you know a person for what that person is. You know the person's father, grandfather, great-grandfather. So no matter what airs he may put on, you'll always say, so-and-so is the son of a scheduled caste. So that becomes very interactive. You're trapped in it. And that is one reason why in the village people don't see too much difference because the idea of who is a scheduled caste, who is not a scheduled caste is known to everybody, though they cannot practice those prejudices in real life. But the ideas are there, the notions are there, and prejudices still exist. In the urban setting, the interactive system doesn't work as well as the attributional system, which is why the scheduled caste entrepreneurs that Surinder has looked at, I think it was quite a pioneering study, and more work of that kind should be done, not only by him, but other people too, because that, I think, tells you in a microscopic fashion what is going to happen in the years to come. So I do hope Surinder will continue reading and writing, as he does brilliantly, and I hope I will have the occasion to meet with him, chat with him, and learn from him. And I'm sure all of you have been very privileged to have him in your midst. And let's hope he keeps coming and is never forgotten like some of us are. My teacher years ago, Professor J.P.S. Oberoi, some of you may have met him. He was quite a perceptive person. And one day I was bragging to him about some sort of a book I wrote, and Professor Oberoi told me that I was his student for a long time. He was my tutor for 3 terms out of 4, which is a bit of a record. And he told me, Dipankar, I'm very proud of you. You're the author of so many rare books. So Surinder isn't an author of rare books. His books are widely read and appreciated, and I hope that there are many more books of that sort to come. Thank you very much.